Hello, what we have here is a 1996 Yamaha YZF600. I have a leaky right front fork. It has been 10 years and 22,000 miles since the seals were last changed. First set of seals went almost exactly the same amount of time and mileage. This would be very similar to a 97 through 07 YZF600R, sometimes called Thundercat, as well as the 95 version and most conventional cartridge forks. While my bike was parked, I noticed that there was a trickle of oil coming down the fork leg and then accumulating in a puddle below it. I traced it back up. I put these rags here just to hold it, and it's definitely coming from this seal. If you run your finger behind the seal, it'll come back and it is oily. If you were to wipe this clean and then cycle the forks up and down a few times, it would actively pump oil out of the seal, and then you would see it more clearly. So if you find a residue, wipe it down, cycle the forks, as in push up and down a few times, see what comes out of there. The actual seal is underneath this. This is called the dust seal or dust cap or dust boot. And you pop that off, and the seal that seals the high pressure hydraulic oil inside is beneath that in this recess. First things first, you need a way to raise your bike off the ground. You do need it on some kind of a rear stand. This is my own homemade rear stand. It was my very first welding project. You can see it's very basic, but it does hold the bike pretty well. If you don't have a rear stand, it is possible to get a buddy, and you can put some blocks underneath the one side, the high side. If this was on its kickstand, it would be leaning like that. Stack some blocks under it, up to the height, and then rock the bike onto those blocks, and then have your buddy put the other blocks on the other side, and you would effectively have like some 4x4s or 6x6s stacked underneath the full length of the swing arm. Or for this particular bike, it has a hollow rear axle. You could put a rod through it, like a solid steel rod. And again, with a buddy, if you had to, you could lift the bike up and you could put a jack stand under it, right underneath the rod that would be coming out here. Or you could even just do jack stands straight under here. Point is, there's a lot of ways to lift a bike. Obviously a proper stand is the best way to go, but I'm trying to demonstrate here that anybody can do this at home if you just get a little creative and be a little bit brave. For the front, I am using a front steering head pin stand. This pin adapter goes up into the steering head, which is right here, this hole at the base of the steering head, and that will lift the bike. For this particular set of stands, it only came with an 18mm diameter pin as the largest pin. What that means, for me, it is just way too small, and that extra slop allows this to flop in there. And then when this arm is up in the air, it allows the plastics to rest against this area here, putting pressure on it, because my pin diameter is too small to effectively lock the bike in place, because it'll rock on here because it's the slop. To fix that, or for any bike that you don't have the right size for, this is a 5/8, 3/8 drive deep well socket. Slide that over the pin. It's the appropriate size to fit in the pinhole, and then as you see, it takes the play out of it and it still locks it. That way the plastics do not rest on this bar. So this is a little trick that you can do to work your way around when you don't have the exact right size pin. For lifting the front, in the past, I have used this large ratchet strap assembly, and I would take this strap and I would put it over the rafters, and then grab this soft strap here, and this would go underneath the steering stem, and making sure not to pinch any wires, but it would wrap down around, and then it would loop this way. And then the big hooks of the ratchet strap would go here, and that lever on the ratchet strap is so large it gives it the mechanical advantage you need. You can ratchet the front into the air. Because the key with a fork job is you need your front supported, but without load on the fork. So traditional front stand isn't going to work because that's going to rest against the bottom of the fork. Then you won't be able to take the leg off. Also, you could take a traditional floor jack with a board, preferably bolted to the floor jack, and go across the headers. On most motorcycles, that would be another way to lift it. It's probably a little sketchy. It can get a bit tippy. Or you could use a motorcycle scissor jack style and screw jack and lift that up that way. those are a couple ways that you can do it to get a bit creative if you don't have the right thing. Fortunately, I do have the pinhead stand for me, so I'll be using that today. We'll see how that goes. The bike is now supported and the wheel can freewheel. Order of operations here isn't as crucial. Some other things, you could take your fender off first, you could take your brake calipers off first. There is the very large front axle nut here. If yours was exceptionally stuck, you might want to break it loose while the bike is still on the ground, have the weight of the bike holding the tire in place. Impact tools certainly make life way easier if you have them. I do, but I'm going to try and do everything with hand tools to demonstrate that it is possible to do this pretty easily at home if need be. This is a 22mm nut. You have these pinch bolts in the front here as well. There's a pinch bolt on either side. Irrelevant to cracking loose the nut, but you certainly have to loosen your pinch bolts before you can drive your axle out that way. First I'm going to remove my fender. Followed by my brake calipers, which I'll bring in for a better view, and then the axle, to remove the front wheel from the fork assembly. In my case, my fender is held on with a Phillips head screw on either side in the front. And then there is a retaining nut on the back tab here. On the inside of the fender, a ratcheting box wrench works very slick to remove that. Standard box wrench would work as well, but it is on the inside of the fender, which you can reach your hand through, where you actually have to get at the bolt to remove. I believe it is a 10mm, and again, a ratcheting box works slick. If you don't have it, there's always another way. Small 10mm. After removing the other side's 10mm internal bolt, if you pinch your fender, you can squeeze it past your wheel and remove it from the bike, getting it out of the way, better access everything else. A little bit of bash there for you. Next I will be removing the brake calipers. On each side they are held on by two 12mm bolts. Upper bolt there, lower bolt slightly askewed from the stand. With the stand in place, it's a little trickier to get a ratchet in there. You could take them off before you get the bike in the air, if it's easier and more accessible for you, depending on exactly what bike you have, but I am able to do this as is. With the bolts removed, you can now rock your caliper off the rotor and away from the bike. Do not press the brake lever when your calipers are off your bike, because you will force your pads together, and it's possible to put enough pressure on them that you can effectively fuse your pads together, making you have to buy new ones. So when the calipers are not attached, remember not to pump the brakes. Also, it's good practice to wire your caliper back out of the way. It's a bad habit, I admit, but for me with motorcycle calipers, I feel they don't weigh enough to matter. I usually let mine dangle. Unless it's an issue of accessibility, then I will wire them. I have repeated the caliper removal on the opposite side, and we're now ready to loosen up the axle nut. And the axle nut on this particular motorcycle is a 22. impact might be necessary. I did this torque to somewhere in the 50 foot-pound range, or a large breaker bar or socket with a pipe, or even an adjustable wrench if you were very desperate. Remove the nut. Is a washer. Next, to remove the axle, we have to loosen the pinch bolts. There's a pinch bolt at the bottom of each fork leg. It actively clamps the lower part of the fork around the axle, capturing the axle, holding it in place. So you can't drive this out if these are still on, unless you're going to hit it with a very big hammer, very hard. Not worth doing. Loosen your pinch bolts. They are an 8mm hex or Allen. You could use a standard Allen wrench. You're much better off investing in a few of these sockets. I think the cheapest set I've seen is a Stanley set at Walmart. I think they're around $8 for the metrics on 3/8 drive. And we're going to loosen both pinch bolts. You don't have to take them all the way out. They just need to be cracked loose. Sometimes they get pretty stuck, and you might need a little persuasion from a hammer to bang these loose, or put a pipe on the end of your ratchet. And you can spin it by hand. That is loose enough. We will repeat for the other side. Our pinch bolts are loose. We can now drive out the axle to remove the wheel, but I'm going to bring you in close so we can look at the spacers and the speedometer drive. On the motorcycle there is a spacer on either side of the wheel. When you remove your axle, these are going to drop. It's important to remember their orientation. This bike has a tapered edge that goes against the bearing and a flanged edge that goes against the fork leg. On the clutch side of the motorcycle, the clutch lever side, this bike uses a cable-driven speedometer. That is this unit here. Note there is an indexing tab at the top that corresponds with the fork leg. This little nub goes into that tab to hold that in place, because this needs to stay stationary, so as the wheel turns, it drives the worm gear in here that spins your speedometer cable and drives your speedometer gauge. This acts as a spacer. When it goes back together, it only will fit one way, and it's important to get everything aligned, otherwise your speedometer won't work. If you do get it back together and the speedo doesn't work, don't panic. You probably just misindexed it and need to pop the axle off again and try again. I'm now going to drive the axle out using my dead blow hammer and tap this side here. Get it going. Once I have enough on the other end, I can just grab it and I can spin it and wiggle it while supporting the wheel. Pull the axle out. That frees the wheel. When it freed, the one spacer fell out immediately. This is the spacer. You need to have that in there so it puts pressure on the inner race bearing, while the outer race is held by the by the wheel, and the inner race is held by the axle to allow your wheels to spin around their bearings. Without this in place, it would be obvious, though, as the wheel would just be sloppy and have lots of play. So it is important to remember all your spacers. Different motorcycles will have different spacer setups. So be aware of what falls out when you pull your axle. I'm going to remove the wheel here. We'll get this out of the way. The speedo drive down here, you just have to give it a wiggle, and it will pop off. There's a rubber seal there on the inside of the wheel, and that holds the drive on. Sometimes you can see there is a rubber seal. I recently replaced my bearings, so all my seals are nice and fresh. If you had brittle ones or you have old bearings, particularly if you have factory original bearings on a pre-2000 motorcycle, it's a good idea to invest the $20-some and replace your bearings front and rear. Anybody at home can do it. You don't need to have a press. I could possibly do another video on that in the future, or there are probably many on the internet already. This is the speedometer drive. There are small tabs here that hook up with prongs that are housed on the wheel, and these interlock with each other, and as the wheel spins, it drives this mechanism in here, and that spins your speedometer cable and then drives your speedometer gauge. So it's these slots that have to match up with the tabs on the wheel when you put it all back together. I should note that there is direction to the wheel, but basically you shouldn't be able to get that wrong because the speedo drive fits only on the one side and it's very obvious where it goes, versus the other side with the spacer has a much smaller oil seal around the wheel. This can just be dangled here while we continue with the fork jack. Now we have a motorcycle with no wheel and no brakes attached. Well, your forked legs, the lowers, will spin freely around because it's a round leg with a round inner tube and a round damper assembly inside, so everything can freewheel. So if you bump them or move them or need to flex something to get, or turn them to get a wheel clearance or anything, you're perfectly fine in doing that. Next up here, we'll have to look at the pinch bolts that hold the forks to the triple trees. And show you those locations, crack them loose, and we will take one leg off. I'm going to bring you in as best I can, handheld style. Let me grab a light. To the best of our abilities, right here is a pinch bolt on the lower triple clamp. That will need to be loosened in order to slide the leg through. Of course, there is one on this side as well. That is the lower pinch bolt. If we go up on the bike, you will see the upper pinch bolt, one on each side. The handlebars, clamp-ons if you will, clip-ons, whatever you prefer to call it, these pinch bolts also need to be loosened before the fork can slide through. So there is 4 pinch bolts that must be loosened to get there. To get at this one, depending on what tools you have, you might be able to get by with a ball end Allen to get there because the handlebar's in the way. Or, after you loosen these 2, underneath this cap is the bolt that holds the clip-on in place. You can undo that bolt, remove it all the way, and then you'll be able to spin the entire handlebar forward, gaining access to this pinch bolt. And this is true with both sides of this motorcycle. Different depending on the motorcycle, but in the YZF600 this is true, and that can definitely help you along the way. Also of note, eventually these caps have to come off, and when this is off the bike and they're loose, it can be tricky to remove them as they are round and it's hard to hold round things. We could just crack these loose right now just to get them loosened up but not removed all the way. There is an O-ring under here so it won't leak out, and then that'll make it easier for us to remove them, and I would recommend doing that. However, you want to loosen these pinch bolts first because they're putting pressure on the threads where these would rest, so we don't want to turn against the tension on the outer tube pushing on the threads of the cap. So after we loosen these pinch bolts, while we're still held here or just at the lower pinch bolt as well, holding the fork stationary, but these 2 are loose, we can crack the caps loose ever so slightly to make it easier to disassemble once the leg is removed from the motorcycle. Right now I'm doing the left clip-on, left handlebar, clutch side handlebar if you will. I'm going to pop this cap off. You can use a pick or a small flathead screwdriver, or you might even have your caps missing. They always seem to go missing. I have popped the plastic cap off. I'm going to put that someplace safe so as not to lose them. It is annoying when they go missing. Next, I will take a 5mm hex socket, and I'm going to crack loose these 2 pinch bolts on the clip-on assembly. These are loose. You can see the handlebar opened up at the pinch point here, at the split line, and you can also feel it. It's gotten much looser. Now we can remove Still a 5mm Allen cap head bolt that connects the clip-on to the upper triple. This will allow us to pivot the handlebar out of the way, enabling us to loosen the upper pinch point. We need to remove this bolt all the way in order to gain the access we need in order to spin the handle. I could be using a mini electric impact or pneumatic, whatever, to speed the job up. If you have them, by all means use them. I'm just trying to show that this can be done with the most basic of tools. Now we can rock the bar up and we can spin it at will. I like to put my bolt back where I found it. This also holds the handlebar out, and then I can crack this bolt loose. This bolt is a 6mm hex. And this one's held down with a bit more force than those other ones. Torque specs will be given when we do reassembly. Right now we're just busting things loose. So we're going to pull that up and get that upper pinch bolt loose. The lower pinch bolt is still tight, holding the whole tube assembly into the fork from rotating. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to crack our cap ever so slightly. The cap is a 27mm. Arguably you could use an adjustable wrench to crack this loose, but it should be torqued properly when it comes to reassembly, so it would be best to have a socket for it. I have an impact socket that is a 27mm. And you certainly can turn the handlebars to gain access here if your windshield stays in the way. So right now I am just going to crack that loose. And I'll probably have to hold the other handlebar here while I turn that. So you can see that didn't go so bad. I'm going to give it just a little bit more. Just a couple, maybe a thread and a half up. I'm starting to see the O-ring there. That way it'll be much easier to disassemble this machine, the fork leg, when it's removed from the bike. So what we have at this point now, our cap is cracked loose. After loosening our pinch bolts, we can now just loosen the lower pinch bolt, which I'll take you down there for, and then we can slide the leg out. The lower pinch bolt is a little more tricky to get at. I find it easiest to go down through the top on this bike, but I don't have the full plastic beauty pieces that the 97 Pluses have, so it might be in your way. So you might have better luck going up from the bottom. It's also a bit bigger. It is a 10mm. So 10mm hex down there. Do your best to crack that sucker loose. Give you a little perspective of where I'm looking. At this point, all of my pinch bolts are loose. The caps have been cracked at the top. I have loosened the lowers. At this point, I can pull a leg out for you. I will start with the leaky one first. You might have to wiggle and twist as you go to get it to come out. At the top there are some zip ties for the wires and cabling to go through. You could cut them and then replace them. Also, you can just pull the leg right through it, just thread it through again when it goes back in. It's probably best to stick with doing one leg at a time with the CA jobs, keep everything together and then not risk intermixing them. I can also pull my rag off now at this point too, but there is one removed fork leg. I'm going to switch up to a better position elsewhere away from the bike, and we'll go over a few things with the actual fork in hand. Now we have a complete leg laying on the table here. A few things to go over. Even though it was leaking, there's still oil in there, unless yours has been leaking for years, in which you might have internal damage as well. But there is oil inside these forks, so we need to drain that into a pan to dispose of. A couple ways we could do it. The manual would have you remove the cap now, all the way, and then pour it out. That will certainly work, and we've cracked this loose before, so it'd be easy to turn that off all the way now. It's a very fine thread in there, be aware of that. But also at some point we have to take the pinch bolt out the rest of the way, back that out by hand, remove your pinch bolt, and if you can look deep inside here, there is a 10mm cap head bolt. This is what gives people trouble from time to time. A couple ways to go about it. This holds the damper assembly together inside the lower leg, so it needs to be removed to disassemble the fork all the way. Definitely if it's rounded or you have big issues, a large easy out could be tried to get this bolt out the bottom, or other creative ways. Just hope that yours aren't. If it's never been touched before, it shouldn't be. But all the more reason to use the exact correct tool so you don't risk messing up your head. And if you do mess up the head and are able to get it out, buy a new bolt. It's not worth sacrificing a little bit of time to go to the hardware store, or even if you have to order one from Yamaha. If you manage to get the mangled headed one out, get in a new one, because the next time around you'll be so happy you did. So a 10mm 3/8 drive. This is that Stanley set I was talking about again. I think it's about $9 for all the metric sizes from 4 through 10, I want to say. Will fit, because this is recessed, so you have to get past that area too. But that will fit into the 10mm, and you can get a good wrench on that. But as we mentioned earlier, the damper assembly in here is round. The fork leg is round. When you try to turn this bolt, odds are it's not going to crack the bolt loose. It's going to just spin internally. A couple ways we can go about that. There is a very big spring inside this fork. Shake that socket out. We've left the cap on. There is still tension on there. We might have enough tension to just turn this out with a ratchet and just crack that bolt loose there. We could try and have a buddy, or if we're ambitious ourselves, compress the fork against our bodies to keep more spring tension on it while trying to crack that loose. The service manual has you use one of those special tools. As we all have been told, at 3/4 inch square tubing, aluminum is what we seem to always get, because you can easily get that at a Home Depot or hardware store. Can be had because the top of the damper rod, which is inside the lower leg, has a square shape up to it. And that square happens to be the same as 3/4 inch outside diameter tubing. You need it to be hollow because the damper rod comes off the body, because it strokes to, it's a piston and rod assembly. Your rod has to be able to go in here and settle, and then this would hold it down into here and lock that into place. And then you put a wrench on this end and you hold this while you crack the bolt loose on the other end. Down here at the base. So it gets to be a lot to hold all together and be able to crack loose. Most of the time a shop will use an impact wrench and just bang this out with the rattle gun. I have one, I can do that. I'm just trying to show you a couple other ways to go about things. Once this is loose, you have the option of, you can just pour and drain the fluid out this way. It's a little more contained than just popping the cap off and dumping it that way. It'll still drain and still do the same thing. Ultimately it all comes apart anyway, so it doesn't really matter which way you prefer to drain. I should note this is your adjuster down here at the bottom. You can leave that alone in that position. You won't have issues with it. Don't try and think you have to back it out for any reason. Just leave it be. It's not a screw that has to come out. You can see where the oil has run and dirtied up the inside of my lower leg. We'll be cleaning all this stuff up as best we can. But this is the leaking fork, and I can see at the top edge of the lip seal where it's kind of shiny and wet. And once I pop this off, I think that'll be more obvious as well. Forks are strong. It takes a bit to move them up and down. I'm not a very strong person, but it just goes to show how much tension is under here. These springs can be dangerous, so when it comes to popping the cap, you have to be extra careful because it's going to want to go boom, you know? So you need to have your hand here and use your muscles to guide it off so it doesn't go flying. The first thing I'm going to tackle before I disassemble too far is I'm going to try this bolt, excuse me. I will set up a tool here. Let's try it with just a regular wrench, ratcheting. I think I'll need an extension for that too. So I got my 10mm down here in the leg, and I know it's fully seated. Always make sure you get that all the way in that recess. And I have had these apart before. Who knows? It might just come apart. I'm not spinning it, but I'm also not turning it. I think I might have to rig up my crappy vise here to hold it in place, and we'll try this again with the other method. In a shop here, I'm just in a single stall garage. It's difficult to make everything work, and I park cars in here as well as 2 motorcycles. This table we're on right now is a fold-up table, so the camera might bounce a little. I could set up the camera on the tripod, but I have it set up here for the moment. We'll give it a try. I only have a small vise, it's a 4-inch vise, but it should be able to hold this in place for us to do what we're trying to do. A strong friend could be substituted for a vise if need be. When you put it in the vise, you definitely want to use some good thick rags to kind of make soft jaws for it to nestle in there. And think about how your vise ended up, clamping it up. I mean, you don't want to squeeze it so tight that you dimple your tube, but also you don't want to put pressure on these little fragile ears where these mounts go. Arguably, you could clamp here, and that should be plenty strong. Think about the load that you'll be applying here as well. If you'll be turning down on it, so if we kind of locked it like this, but make sure that this ear is free, we should be okay with that. I'm just going to try and chuck it up, sneak it in here like this. And I'm checking my little ear because I really don't want anything bad to happen to my forks, because I'd have to replace the entire leg, or the outer tube, the lower tube. So I'm just snugging it up to hold it in place. And we're going to try just the standard tool, center ratchet here, see if I can make anything happen with just this. So I'm turning, and now I'm turning against that. This ear is not touching anything. This bigger piece here is locked against that, so that should hold it in place. And I'm trying to crack that loose, and I'm not successful. I'm going to switch over to a breaker bar instead of just a ratchet. Just demonstrating that there are so many different ways that you can approach these types of problems. So here's a breaker bar. Notice I'm turning the whole, you probably can't see it, but I'm turning the whole tube. There's some tape here to use as a reference point, but I am turning the whole inner thing. So that's probably not going to work. You could try putting some tension on here to make that go. Might help, it might not. We could try, I have a cordless impact. Let's see if that has enough oomph to it. I doubt it will. So we have our rigid here, little mini cordless lithium-ion impact. Wrong adapter, I need a 3/8, not a half. We can bang on it with this a little bit, see what happens. That isn't going to happen. It's not meant for that. We could get out the air and use the big boy impact, which I'm sure will work, but I want to show you how to do this as much as possible with regular tools. So I'm going to we'll do it the special tool way. I am going to remove the cap, and we'll drain the oil that way. And then we will insert our special tool, and then remove this lower bolt. Sit tight while I change my setup. What we've done now here, I have the inner tube snugged up in the vise in my soft jaws, and I'm going to turn the cap the rest of the way. You could take some of the tension off by screwing out your preload adjuster, mark your position of where you had it so you can put it back, and that'll take some of the spring tension off. I'm just going to take it off as is, and as far as your clicker settings go, you can leave that as is. Odds are they're going to get changed when you put it back together. You can sure try to keep everything indexed the same way, but something might get off, so you might have to go back and readjust these. Most people probably wouldn't even notice the difference, truthfully, riding around, but that's something to be aware of as well. I am going to slowly remove this cap once I get the right socket. If you recall, this is a 27 millimeter. I'm going to do this ever so carefully. It's a very fine thread, and it's longer than you would think, so you constantly have to be worried about it flying somewhere. I am wearing glasses in case something awful happens. Whenever you work with springs, it's always nerve-wracking when you're taking that tension off. Things don't go flying. Here it comes. Nice and controlled. Nice and controlled. Keep the tube high there. If you were to compress that tube right now, you would squirt oil all over. I'm going to change the camera setup so I'm not bouncing you around. You can have a better view. fork is still clamped in the vise. We're now zoomed in on the top cap here. It's all loose on the tension. It's still attached here. Notice I can't really go much farther with it here. I can slowly, I'm pulling up the damper assembly here. I'm stroking it. But I'm actually going to have to loosen. Well, I think first I'll dump out a little bit of oil here. Hold tight. I'm going to zoom you back out. Loosen this. Let's dump a bit of oil here. At this point, no other parts should be falling out, so you shouldn't really worry about finding anything. I'm just dumping out a bit here so we can make clearance. It takes a while for all this stuff to come out. Wipe that down here. Because what we need to do is we need to lower the inner tube inside the outer tube, or push up on the outer tube, which is what I'm doing here for your benefit, so you can see better. Now we can see the cap and the washer and the spring. Make this a little bit better if I can. Forks get to be a little bit long, awkward to get camera angles that we're after, but now it's still separated, and I'm going to slide down the inner tube. That's going to expose a few things here. Okay. Cap here, you can pull up on the rod assembly. There is a washer. Remember orientation of your parts before you take things off. But there is a nut. It's a jam nut. It's locking the top cap here to the damper rod, which is what we're attached to, the inner rod where this nut is. So we need to hold this in place using the flats up here from that 27 mil, and then crack this nut loose. The position of this matters. You will measure millimeters of thread showing when you put it back together, but it's also easier, of course, to try and leave things together as much as they can. So let's just crack it enough loose, and then we can spin this off by hand. Note the damper rod assembly will fall into the tube. At this point in the game, sorry for the autofocus, at this point in the game, it's okay if it falls into the tube, because we're taking it all out anyways. But just remember the orientation of your spring as well when we take it out, so that there is a top and a bottom. It's not worth a bad idea to wrap a piece of tape around the top end so you know that was the top. And then lay everything out on some clean cloths on your workspace, which is something I'm going to have to set up here before we get too much further. So let me get the tools necessary to crack this jam nut loose, and we'll remove this portion. I believe I misspoke a minute ago. You will be holding by the flats of your preload adjuster, which is 17 millimeter, because you can see here the blue anodized piece is what you're turning against. This is what puts the extra load using this washer here onto the spring to compress it more to give you more preload. So you will be holding at the top here with your flats, which is 17 mil, and then this lower nut, which is a 14 millimeter, and just crack it loose. I have loosened the jam nut down here, and then we can turn the cap off. There is an O-ring here. Let's see if we can get that to focus. Sorry about that. Which you would want to inspect for tears, nicks, damage. You can certainly reuse it. I've been in these forks before, and with the age I did buy some new O-rings to replace it. O-rings are around $6 a piece if you want to do it. However, looking at this one, I'm sure I could reuse it just fine because it seems to be in perfect condition. Okay, I'm going to dump some more oil out of this if I can get any. Since I took the cap off, I'm going to be aware of these loose parts here. This washer can come off. You can either hold it in place, take it off, and put everything in the order in which you found it on your nice clean workstation. So I'm going to try and dump a bit of oil here. I'm going to stroke the inner tube to see if I can pump any oil out of here. Get a couple. take the spring out. As I mentioned before, there is a top and a bottom to most springs if they're progressive springs. I am going to flag the top of mine with a piece of tape. Seems like a smart idea. But also, if you were to keep it in the same orientation in which you pulled it, still losing some oil here, that would be fine too. Always get a bit messy doing forks. I don't think I can give you a very good shot inside the tube of the top of the damper assembly where the square tubing will notch up when it's assembled. Once we get it out, I'll show you it and you can see what you're notching up into. I'm going to set it back up in the vise again and we'll try and remove our lower bolt. I have the special tool inserted into the fork, and I'm holding that with the wrench here stationary. I have the breaker bar situated with a 10mm Allen socket at the base. I'm going to hold against each other as best I can and see if I can't crack it loose with this method. There it went. Certainly an impact makes life easier, but there's always a way. I'm going to switch over to my ratchet here and spin this bolt out. The bolt has a copper crush washer around it, so be aware of that. So if it drops, find it. If it comes with the bolt or stays behind. Technically you should replace it with a new one. I intend to. You could arguably reuse it. I have. Most people do. And you can probably get away with that. But you don't want to double it down. So just be aware that it's there. So if you replace it, you're not stacking two on top of each other. And you're just using the one. Might need to grab a magnet here. Get that the rest of the way, or we could certainly tip it out, but I have a magnet here. Let's see if we can pull this bolt out. My pan underneath there in case any trickles. My copper washer did not come with it, that's still in there, so I will have to fish that out. But this is the bolt, that is the head. Again, if you get these the hex goobered up, you're going to want to replace this. This is going to be a special order part. It's technically a banjo bolt. There's a hole in there. I was thinking of older bikes when it was just a standard bolt. But this is a banjo. It goes against the oil lock collar, which we'll show you once we disassemble the rest of the fork here. So I'm going to set this on my towel, and I'm going to fish out the washer with a pick. There's the copper crush washer that I removed from the lower fork vertical with the pan beneath it. Now that the lower bolt is removed, and you can stroke the inner tube up and down a little bit and stroke the damper. And that's going to pump out oil through the bottom right into your pan. There's always going to be some residual oil. Get as much as you can. There's less to go out on your table that you have to clean up later. Grab this here rod. The inner rod will just pull all the way through the smaller diameter round, so we're not going to grab that. We're going to grab the part that's threaded with our jam nut on it. I'm going to pull that body up. And here comes the damper assembly. I'll bring you in for a close up in a little bit. On the bottom here, there is the oil lock collar, which did not come with it. Here's the internal damper rod assembly. This is the threaded part where that lower bolt goes in. As you can see, it's round, and if we're in a round tube, that's why this whole thing spins when you try to loosen it. This assembly goes up and down. You can pump it, and oil will come out. This is the internal rod, which is your clicker adjustment, goes against this. And this is just basically a tube. But you can see how oil flows in and out of the passages here at the bottom, and that's what makes a cushion for you to ride on. This top collar piece here, you can see where the square shape is. You can see how the tubing works, because the tubing is going to go over this rod assembly, which is attached. We can't take that apart. And we lock it onto there, and then we can hold it with a wrench here to hold the round part stationary against while we turn our bolt on the bottom. Next, I'm going to be prying off my dust seal, dust cap, dust boot, whatever you prefer to call it. I'm going to use a small screwdriver. You can use a pick in there, and we're going to get between the fork leg and the seal and work our way around it, topping it off. You can reuse these. Certainly if yours is in good shape, you should. Save you 20 bucks for a pair. I think my set of seals came with new ones, so I will be replacing it. As you see, that just slides, and we can slide this all the way off the fork. This is what your dust seal looks like. There we go. See that the top has the tapered flange, that's the up, and obviously it's only going to fit one way. There is a lip ring in here, oil lip seal. It just seals up contaminants from getting to the actual hydraulic seal, the oil seal, and wearing it out prematurely. It's always a good idea to keep your fork legs clean, shiny chrome. So if you got a lot of bug guts and everything on it, this is supposed to scrape these away, but you're better off cleaning that yourself, and that way you won't get contaminants down into your oil seal and have your seal fail prematurely. All seals do wear out eventually, so everybody with a motorcycle, you keep it long enough, you will end up doing forks. This is the actual oil seal, and I can see where mine's been leaking. It's wet, it's contaminated, it's not right. There's always some method of retention that holds the oil seal into the fork. On this bike, it is a wire spring clip. Some bikes, it's a snap ring. If it's a snap ring, by all means, you need to buy snap ring pliers. It's worth a couple dollars even to get a Harbor Freight one. You could try to grind down a needle nose, or even just use a standard needle nose, which I had to do one time in a pinch, and it was just awful to work with. Get the appropriate snap ring plier when dealing with a snap ring. But this being a spring wire, I just have to pry the edge here and work my way around and pop it up, pop it out of its groove. There we go. The wire is free. I can pull that up and out of the way. You could replace that if they get corroded, but I mean, it's a wire. If it's in one piece, I think you're safe to reuse. But they do exist. You can buy them. Now all we're left with is the seal at this point. To get the seal out, the ideal way is you grab your inner tube and you pull up on it, and you're going to eventually hit the bushing of the inner tube, which is at the bottom of the tube, which you'll see when it comes out. And that's going to smack against the seal, and as a slide hammer, it's going to pop its way out. Kind of hold this end, put it in the vise, and bang it out. And this usually works. Sometimes you need a buddy to hold that as well. If you get in a real bind, you could drill a tiny hole, or even just with the small screw, and get a small screw into only the rubber part of the seal. That's what's so crucial about it. And you could get a screw in there, and then maybe you could get a locking plier on there, and then try and pry it up that way. Hopefully your seals aren't too cemented in. If you're working on a 70s era motorcycle that's never had its forks opened up, odds are they're going to be glued in there. Other tricks you might even use is a little bit of heat, and I mean a little bit of heat, like propane torch, just kissing it around this edge, mostly just to break up any kind of a glue that's been going on between the rubber and the aluminum in this case. Let me reset the camera and we'll try the slide hammer method, see if we can pop this seal out. Alright, I'm being honest here. I don't know how well this is going to work. I've definitely done it before, but hopefully this will pop out not too terribly. There it went. That one was not bad at all. We'll pull this in closer for close-up for you. This is the oil seal. That can just slide straight up the top. These are oiling holes that allow fluid to move in and out. There's this spacer. And then this is the lower bushing, this is the upper bushing. It rides in the lower fork leg. I'll show you that in a future video here. This moves up and down, and that's banging against this spacer, and then that's pushing against the seal, and that's what actually popped the seal. This is the lower bushing. So we're on the inner tube. This is the inner tube's lower bush, and that's clamped onto the fork in a machined recess, so that can't let this get past it, and that's how you can bang your way up. These slide metals, most people don't replace, truthfully. You should. I'm going to do it this time because this is the second time I've been in these forks, and we'll inspect these closer once I get them cleaned up, and we'll compare them to the new ones. They are something you have to order through Yamaha, which is the hang-up for most people if you're waiting on parts. They are about $8 a piece, so there's 4 of them, so it's $32 more to your fork job. But it's not, it's cheap insurance. If you're in here, it's time to do it. This particular bike has 44,000 miles on it. This is its second set of seals. I'm definitely replacing my bushings, my O-rings, anything that's consumable this time around. First time around, and you got a lower mileage bike, and you visually inspect them, and they inspect good, you're probably okay to go for a while. me show you the inside of the lower tube here, the lower leg. If you look in here, you can see all this grime and grunge in there. Definitely add some water, get past that seal maybe. It's a little grungy. We definitely want to clean this up as best we can, which we're totally going to do. Now at this point I'm going to turn this upside down and we're going to get the oil lock collar off this. This goes at the bottom of the damper. I'm going to put the leg assembly away. This is what's at the bottom of the damper assembly. What we shook out of that lower leg here is called the oil lock piece. Got some squares there. It basically covers the lower holes to help regulate the flow of oil and always keep some oil in front of those holes so you never suck air, because that will always be encapsulated. I'm still dripping some oil off the other end here. I have to clean this out, but this is in the inside of the lower leg. You can't get this out until you pop the inner leg from the outer leg, and then this will shake up the bottom. So think of that when you're reassembling. You need to put this in the lower leg first before you set your seal in. Otherwise you're not going to be able to do it after. And the reason for that is it's a tapered fitting. I'm dripping oil all over the place here. So you're not going to be able to run this through the inner tube to make it to the bottom, because this is how it fits. So it needs to be inside the outer leg, the outer tube, before you put the inner tube in, and then as this goes in, that's going to have to settle against it. And it's going to be like that. Here's something that's often left in mystery. The upper bushing, the larger diameter bushing, just slides in, and that rides in the machined lip here of the outer fork leg. So that one's pretty straightforward into how that one just sits in there. The lower one always was a mystery to me as to how do people replace it. No one ever really shows it, but it has a split line in it. You just take a standard screwdriver here and flex this, and then slide it off the bottom. There's a machined recess here, so it can only fit one way, and your new one you would flex on and slide it on there as one that's going to maintain its capture. I believe it's some kind of a Teflon coated bushing. It's copper and then coated. I have quite a bit of copper showing. That's certainly one way to show wear on these. We can look at my upper one, has more wear. See that shining through, and I'll show you some new ones here later on when we reassemble, but I think it was a good time to replace these. We have to clean everything as well as we can. This is a old clean t-shirt, and use our special tool here as a ramrod, and cleaned out the inner of the inner fork tube, and wipe that clean there to get as much of that out as we can. Certainly you could probably use some mild solvents to help with that, but also the outside of the tube. It's a very good time to polish this, because if there was any nicks in here as we put our new seal down, it might cut the new seal, and then we wouldn't have a seal. So you get some chrome metal polish here and give it as much of a shine as you can. You can put it on a buffing wheel and take the opportunity while it's apart to get things clean. Same is true for the outer leg, or lower leg. It's definitely got some grunge on it. The outside, it's nice when things are clean too, but it's really about the inside being clean. And be aware of anything you might have forgotten. Perhaps your crush washer is still there, or your oil lock piece might still be in there as you're cleaning and things fall out. Remember where they came from. At this point here, I have cleaned my outer, lower, and inner, upper tubes. I took some chrome polish on here, and while you're cleaning up your inner tube, check for any nicks, rust spots. If you have them and they're in the line of travel where the seal will pass through, you might develop a leak. And if it's a raised nick, it could cut the seal and then leak very badly. A little emery cloth, you could possibly level it off and maybe get by, but if you have real damage, then you would need to replace your inner tube, which I think is about 180 per tube. Also, when it's apart right now would be the time you could set it up on some V-blocks, and you could measure runout of your fork tube with a dial indicator and the V-blocks to see if they're straight. I know mine are slightly torqued by 2000s, I believe, when last time I did this, again, 20-some thousand miles ago, and They're no more tweaked than they were before, so I'm leaving it, but it'd be an opportunity for you if you suspect a problem to inspect. If we could talk about our slide metals, or bushings at the moment here. This one's a new one. If we can get the zoom to zoom. This is a used one. You can see how the coating here has got some pits to it and where it's been wearing down. Certainly the inside of the bush here is worn from spinning, but this is the lower one on the inner leg, the one that's in the machined recess, so it does spin around there, but it's not moving up and down, so that's how that one wears. You can see all the copper showing. You can see the new one doesn't have any copper showing. So you can inspect yours for wear. If you see it, it's worth ordering them to do them while you have it apart. Better yet is to order them ahead of time. It sucks to cost more money, but it's probably worth doing. I'm going to install the new slide metal or bushing to the lower inner tube. This is the one that you have to expand to make it over into the machine groove. I'm just expanding it by hand here, and I'm putting it in position, trying to hold the tube with my body while I'm spreading this open. I think I might use the screwdriver to help here to flex this open, just to make life a little easier. There we go, it snaps into place. New beautiful bushing. We will take the damper assembly and we're going to gently slide it into the inner tube so it sticks out the bottom. Slow and easy so as not to mar up the inside too terribly much. The spring assembly on the damper has a collar around it with this tapered edge here that stops against it. So our damper isn't as far as it will go at the moment. Take your oil lock piece and slide that over the end. And this whole assembly will go into the outer tube. We want to gently coat it with some fork oil around the bush and around these metal pieces just to avoid any galling and ease the installation. I will carefully slide the inner tube assembly with the oil lock piece and damper installed, except it fell off. That back on. I'm going to slide the outer tube over it. It's a little easier to control. My bushing is lubricated. My slide metal piece was lubricated. I have now bottomed out the inner tube into the fork leg. I'm going to stand it up here temporarily. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to be putting in the bottom bolt again through this hole. And that'll hold the damper and inner fork leg assembly together, allowing us to work on it further. We'll use a new copper crush washer and we'll install the bolt. You may have to apply some pressure to the damper, which you can do by putting your finger here in the open end and pushing down to hold that against there to get the bolt started into the bottom of the damper. Screwing this bolt in, start it by hand, get a good feel for it, so you know, and make sure your crush washer is on the end. And we're going to go up to the bottom here. Attempt to start the threads. Start it easy, start it right away. You can't go very far because of course it's just going to spin on you. So we're going to set up our special tool again. I'm going to put this in the vise and then we will torque this. I have the special tool set up again. That end of the pipe, the square tubing, which I will be holding against, and I will be torquing the bottom bolt here to the factory spec of 29 foot-pounds. removing the special tool gently. Again, we don't want to gall anything. At this point we will be putting the oil seal back on. We have another piece, other bushing, the upper bushing for the outer tube to put on, and then our spacer, and then our oil seal, and then our retaining wire, our, I guess we'll call it retaining clip will go on, and then our new dust seal on top of that. You may notice I put some tape here. This is so when we slide the seal over we don't risk catching the edge of the tube and ripping the lips. So we're going to lube the seal, probably put a little bit of light lube on the fork leg itself too, and we're going to slide those down, and then we're going to drive the seal in. I am going to reset the fork vertical, try to move the camera for you, and then we'll apply our bushing, our spacer, our oil seal, our retaining clip, and our dust cap in the next set. Here I have the new bush. It's the bigger of the two bushings. It's thicker and a little taller. I have lubricated it with some fork oil, as well as this whole inner tube here. I have put a light coating of fork oil on there, and we're just going to slide this over the top. A little bit of stiction to get over past that tape, but then it's just going to go straight down. And we kind of need that to settle into its machined recess. What we'll do is we'll take our spacer, which was the next item in order, and we're going to slide that over the top. There is a tapered edge which was up in my position, and I maintained orientation when I took it out originally, and that's the way I'm going to put it back on. Always best to maintain orientation when you can. As far as those bushings go, they're tapered on both edges, so there really is no up or down. So I'll be installing this spacer. Let me bring you in here. What you'll see here is this is not deep enough in the groove. Our bushing hasn't settled down yet, so we don't have the space to get the oil seal. When we drive the oil seal, that'll go down as well. We could take our little screwdriver here with a rag over it, and we could tap it in place here to get it seated in the groove. Wow. Wiggling the tube here, get that. Maybe I can show you if I grab this magnet. Pull that up. You can see our bushing hasn't settled down there yet, and you have to drive that in. Next would be the oil seal. You can see now that my bushing is now below the line where it's supposed to be. To do that, I'm using a homemade seal and bushing driver. Excuse me, same tool I'll be using to drive the seal, which is it's 2-inch PVC. But you do have to put a little taper to the edge. It's just ever so slightly too thick. I used a bench grinder on it. You could file it, you could sandpaper it, you could use whatever you want. Make sure you get all the strings off of it. But that little taper allows it to go on either side here into the fork leg, and then I tapped with a hammer up top to drive the bushing down. The bushings are what the fork leg actually rides against, and that's why they wear, so they move. The one attached to the inner tube moves up and down with the tube. The other one is fixed into the outer tube, which makes this tube ride against it, so it takes the play out of your fork, so it rides against that bush. At this point, I will put on the oil seal, which I need to take out of the package, and we'll go over the oil seal. The new oil seal. This is where all the magic happens. This is the business end of what we're up to. Manufacturers will have different methods of making these things, and in this case the double lip goes towards the oil. There's a ridge here and a second ridge in there. You'll see the big open void. Typically that will go down, so this is going to go this way. This is the oil side, this is the top side. Also, typically as a rule of thumb, the lettering, any of the part numbers or anything on the mold are going to go up. So this will go down into the oil side. This is going to slide over the fork and down, and then we'll have to drive it into position with our homemade driver there. We'll show you what we're going to do with that, as to make sure we don't damage this seal when we drive it home. First, we need to lubricate the seal. Service manual says to use a little bit of white lithium grease on the inside here. You could use more fork oil. We have pre-lubed our fork as well too. but I will use a little dollop of grease and grease the inside here, and then we'll slide it on. Now that the bushing is driven down where it belongs, we have the clearance to get the spacer in and the oil seal and then the spring clip. We're going to slide our spacer in with the taper going up, which is the way we found it. Slide that in like so. That's just going to rest there. Next we'll take our oil seal, which I have lubed with some white grease, and I'm going to gently flex it over the top to make sure I don't catch anything. That's why the masking tape is up there. I'm working it over, and now I'm going to slide it down. I can try and push it in by hand as much as I can. See how far I can get with that. And that one's moving pretty easy actually. I'm going to try and just use the seal driver with just my hand and just kind of work the edge a little. See if I can get it to sit home. And I'm meeting some resistance now to a point where I think I'm going to have to actually drive it. You can just put this right on here and you can drive, but you might damage the upper lip of it. So, the smart thing to do is take your old oil seal, clean it off, and we'll put that on top of the new oil seal, and that'll act as a little buffer zone for our two seals. Now pop the old oil seal on top of the new oil seal, and I'm going to get my driver here, and I'm just going to kind of work the edge here and drive it down. Just trying to get it even if I can. That side's moving, I just have to even it up. It got a little off kilter. I'll bring in the other half of this. Some people use a hose clamp to hold this together. I find just using my hand is fine, and then I hold the hammer the lengthways, and we tap it in. Keeping it as even as we can, and then we'll check. So we pop that off. And then we can take our old seal, which I'm just going to use a pick to leverage up, and we're going to check. We're not all the way down yet on that seal, so we're going to go back and hit it some more. Sometimes I find just using the one half and just working my way around works too. But sometimes you also do have to give it a little force to get it to go where it needs to go. Okay, we are in. I'll bring you in to show you. This is probably going to be difficult to see, but well, the camera doesn't want to focus. But the groove where the ring rests is fully exposed all the way around, and you can kind of see it. So that means I can get my snap ring in all the way. So this is deep enough. It will also bottom, and you should feel that when you're hitting. But a visual inspection of that groove, if you can see the groove and get the snap in, you're set. I'm going to put the snap clip on. Go over the top. There's no real up or down to this. It just goes on. And we're just going to have to work it around here. We're going to try and get it in one groove first. And compress it. And walk our way around. Making sure that it fully seats into the groove. You can do a visual inspection and you can tell if it's in there or not. I know it's going to be hard to see on camera, but when you look at it with your eyes, you'll see the groove and you'll see the wire resting in there. And I can guarantee this this wire is fully seated. The clip is fully in the groove, holding our new seal in place. Our new fork assembly should be sealed and tight, and we will move on to adding fluid. I could put the new dust seal on right now. That's a good point. I'd put it on later as well, but I might as well put it on now. I have this set up. The replacements here, these are from All Balls Racing. They're slightly different than the factories. It doesn't mean they won't work. You could argue maybe they're not as pretty, but you could also argue they might work better. This is a factory one. Just a tapered lip there. The All Balls here has a spring clip around that lip seal holding it tighter. You could argue it makes a little better seal than the other one, but the installation is the same. They both just press in. A little lubrication on this inside is a good idea whenever we're sliding something over something else. And we're just going to push it down right in there. Just lubing up the lip of that. Going over the top. Bringing her down to rest. And working it in. There is our new dust seal. Let's take a minute here and talk about fork oil and measuring. The manual specifies a 5-weight fork oil or equivalent. I've elected to go with a 7.5 weight, which is what I ran last time. To get a 7.5, you can take a container of 10 and a container of 5, and you end up with 7.5. You can make custom weights of oils by mixing that way based on percentages. Not many people sell a 7.5. I think there might be a couple companies. Basically, each leg takes around 15 fluid ounces. Fork oil is typically sold in a pint, which is 16 fluid ounces. So I bought a pint of 5 and a pint of 10, and then I compound them in this brand new container here. It was the cheapest container I could find. It was $1.80 Walmart to make my 7.5 oil there. To set your oil height or capacity or level, depending on what phraseology you want to use, you could go by fluid ounces or milliliters. Those specifications are given in the manual. You could measure that out and pour it in here, bleed it out by stroking it, which we'll show you here, and assume that's good. It's important that both legs receive the same amount of oil. So going by ounce-wise is close. It's very close because there's probably always going to be some residual fluid in your forks that you couldn't quite clean out. So yes, you can guarantee that you put in, for example, 15 ounces per leg, but one leg might have had a little more residual in there, so technically it's slightly higher. Would that be okay? Most likely yes. In street riding it would be fine. To measure like that cheaply, graduated cylinder is nice, which you can eBay. A baby bottle, brand new baby bottle, we want to make sure everything's clean and never ever use it for anything but oil once you do that. You can measure out in milliliters on a baby bottle pretty accurately and fill that way. For rough fills, I have a measuring cup. I keep it in the baggie. The only thing I use it for is fork oil, and that just gets me close. The best way to do it, the final level, is to measure. You measure your air gap at the top, the distance between the top of the oil level and the top of the fork. And in this case, and in most cases, it's with the inner tube fully compressed. That's all the way down without the spring in there. The damper assembly is in there, of course, because it's bolted together, but the spring is not, because the spring will displace the oil. And we don't want the spring to displace the oil when we're doing this. The manual will give you that measurement in millimeters. I'll look it up here when we get it later. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 137 millimeters from the top. A couple ways you could do that. You could take a scale, a simple scale like this, and you could put it in there. You want to make sure it's clean. And you could hold it against it and look down. This would be on the inside. For example, say you put it on your 137 millimeters there, and you fill your oil up to the bottom of that while you're looking in there. That's perfectly fine. They sell tools that are essentially a little vacuum or a syringe, which has a stick hard rod at the end there, which you would measure off. Motion Pro in particular don't have one, for example, here. I'll show you there, but it's a rigid rod. It's hollow, it's a tube, and it has markings on it from the Motion Pro one. It's pre-measured for you with a little retaining clip, so it's very slick because it'll hold it in place and do that. What I do is I have a brake bleeder, a one-man hand bleeder, and I have a piece of brake line tubing there, and I measure off the tubing, and I put the tubing in there to my 137 millimeters right here, and then I pump the hand pump, and once it stops sucking, well, I know it sucked exactly to that level, and that's a repeatable measurement because I can use my same marking that I made. Usually I put a piece of tape on there and hold it in the same position on the other fork leg and vacuum it out. So you slightly overfill and then suck some out to bring it to the exact level. It's a method that is most preferred. Different ways of doing things as always, but it can be done at home whether you want to buy anything for it or not. Point to note is if you're buying 2 containers of fork oil, that gives you 32 ounces, you're going to need to use about 30. So that doesn't leave a lot for spills or accidents, so be aware of that when you're filling and taking care of it. At this point, what we need to do, when we start to fill here, I'm going to set the fork more upright, which might make it harder for you to view, because I'm going to have to hold it by the ear here. Crank this in, because I want the fork to be more square. Which apparently I can't do. There we go. Be more square there. We need to pull the rod up, and there is a special tool that threads to the end of the damper rod, because this is going to fall into the tube now. And we need to be able to stroke this when we bleed it, this rod here. And once that falls in the oil, that's going to be tricky to come by. So a good trick to do, if you don't have the special tool which threads onto the end here, or you make one, so then you have a rod to hold with, is you get a piece of wire. You wrap a piece of wire here below the jam nut or on the threads, and that just allows you to be able to fish this out as this falls down over and over again here. Just stroke that. I'm going to get my wire set up here, and we'll come back and we'll do our initial fill and bleed cycle. I filled here the rest of the way. I sighted down, and my oil level is more like in this area, of course, which is closer to the full, so using my method definitely gave us enough oil to cover. Now using our wire, when we start our first bleed, we will use the damper rod, which is attached to our wire, and we pull up and down slowly 10 times. What we're doing is we're bleeding out any air in the system, and it may end up pumping oil up through the top. Be ready for that. Don't be startled if anything happens to squirt out or anything. Just use our rod here. And as it bleeds out, you'll feel oil filling the inner orifice of this hollow rod, and you'll feel the cushion of oil acting upon it as it settles down and everything smooths out a little bit. I forgot how many that was. Was that 3 or 4? Let's just say it was 3. Let's say this is 4. And our point of going slow here is to give a chance for the air to escape and not to encourage any new air bubbles in our fluid. Let's say that was 4. Notice how much slower it's reacting now as it actually has oil to go through. You can see the dampening effect of our damper assembly. So this must be 6. too much, that's okay. You really can't do this too much. It's just how much time do you want to commit to this process. You also notice as you're bleeding it, your oil level is going to get lower because it's filling in voids that it wasn't there before. Which is why you always have to set your final oil level after you do your bleed down. This is 10. Of course, it's good to note we don't have any leaks out the bottom where we put the bolt in with the crush washer. That would be bad if we had a leak. We would have seen that by now. I should have pointed that out. There's our 10th stroke of that. We're going to leave our wire attached because we're going to need to pull that rod up again. We have to attach the cap. And at this point then we stroke the inner tube. We're not supposed to exceed the full travel of this bike, which is about 5.31 inches. So we're only going to go maybe 5 inches in stroke. And we're going to do this, say 10 times. And we'll pull up on this. And for reference of height, I think we'll just put a piece of tape here, and that way we can see our start and stop points better. I'm curious, just what is 5 inches? I have my pocket scale here. That's a bit higher than I was going, something about there. That. I'm never counting. Say it was 6. So here's 7. I'm kind of pulling against some suction there. I can feel how it's kind of after it comes off bottom. Of course, when it's assembled, it'll never really be at bottom unless you hit a super, super hard bump. So once that spring's in there, it's going to pull this whole inner tube all the way up. Let's call that good. Now we need to let that sit for 10 minutes and let any air evacuate from the system. We'll look down into the tube at our oil level and make sure we don't have any bubbles forming, but this should be bled per the factory manual specifications. I'm going to let it sit 10 minutes and we'll catch up then. It's been over 10 minutes now and the oil has settled inside the fork leg here. I was just setting up my sucker tool. It's just your standard cheapo Harbor Freight one-man brake leader vacuum pump. With a piece of brake line here that I rigged up into the tube, and I've measured up the appropriate height here. The manual specifies 137 millimeters from here. I have elected to go with a smaller air gap. I've effectively raised the oil level higher in the tube because I have a smaller number down, meaning the oil has to be higher to meet my smaller number. I went 5 millimeters smaller, so I'm 137 minus 5 is 132 millimeters here. You can take your caliper and you can measure like that. You can take your pocket scale, whatever device you have that's accurate, and then mark it off. The key thing here is to make sure you have the same on both forks. A mil or two hither or thither isn't going to matter, and it's a tuning element people can do to change your air gap. They're effectively changing your air spring within your fork leg. I've chosen to do it the sucky method here. You could just, again, take your pocket scale, you can measure, you could just trust your ounces. Different ways of doing things. The main thing here is you want to get them to be as accurately the same as possible. And that being said here, it's not very perfectly level within my vise. I'm going to remove it from the vise, and I'm going to freestand it on my concrete floor here on this flat, which is as true straight up and down as I can get, so that when I'm sucking out my fluid, I will have a level surface to be sucking from. My oil height, my level is just too low right now after it's all settled and been bled, and of course I didn't even put in the full amount to begin with. I only put in 400 milliliters, not 431. So I need to add a little bit more oil to bring it up high enough so I'm able to suck it down to the exact level that I need. So I'm going to add a little bit more into my measuring cup here, just maybe be 100 milliliters. And it doesn't have to be super accurate for what I'm doing at the moment, and I can always pour it into the other leg. The point is you want to make sure you're keeping your fork oil in your clean containers when we're having such a limited quantity on hand. And again, we want to pour slowly, give everything a chance to kind of level off. No bleeding is required at this point, either it's already bled or just adding to the overall level. And we should give it a chance to settle though if there were any air bubbles generated from pouring. And no sense filling it way more full than we need to when we're just sucking it out anyways. The stuff that we remove via the vacuum we can't reuse because it's going into a dirty container and it's just going to be waste. I finally went and got my Pelican flashlight here so I can see inside this thing, which is a lot more helpful. Taking my sucking instrument that has been measured and putting it in there. It is below the oil level. I am just going to hold that in place here against its height mark. And my main goal here is just so it's repeatable. Okay. I'm going to suck here. I'm sucking fluid. There it is. That's even. That's all she wrote, folks. Perhaps you could argue that it might not be the 100% accurate because I'm not using a clip and I'm holding it there. I'm going against the tape line and things are rocking, but again, it's going to be so close, it'd be infinitesimally small. And as long as it's repeatable, which this process is totally repeatable on my other fork when the time comes here. I'm going to insert my new my spring. Remember my top was flagged and that is up. I'm going to remove my tape before I put it in just so it's easier. I don't have to fight it once it's in there. Make sure there's no tape residue left. And then I'm going to thread my wire through so I can keep that. You could take the wire off and then rewire it out by get your fingers in there and you could potentially contaminate the oil by putting your hands in it. So this way is just a little bit safer, although a little odd to be threading wire through a spring. Put that vertical and we're going to very slowly lower it in there, because if we were to go fast, it could displace our fluid too much and squirt out. Also keep an eye on the level. We may have to slide the inner tube up here this time to meet it so we don't overflow our fork oil as we are displacing it by putting the spring in here. So we need to have that extra height and our inner leg. Like just dropping it in easy enough in. Perfect. Fork's a full extension here. Probably have to cheat it down slightly so I can expose this, but I don't want to go too far so you can't see. Get up here. There, we can still grab our damper. The manual specifies this as the cap bolt. Well, let's take a moment here to look at it more closely. This is your preload adjustment. And by turning this, all you do is effectively extend this inner part here. A little stiff to do, as is. Grab my 17 mil. You're turning this in and out. Just making that longer or shorter puts more tension on the spring inside the fork leg. Good idea to note your adjustment settings before you take it apart, or if you did as I recommended and you did one fork at a time, I can go look at my other side and I can match these settings to that, because I didn't make note of it and I've been playing with it here, demonstrating on how it works. The compression, or is it rebound? I think it's compression adjustment, sorry. Up here is a clicker. It might be very hard to see in there, but there you can see as you turn that. Yeah, you're not going to be able to see in there. As you turn that clicker adjustment, that pushes another, basically it's a screw in or out, and it gets longer or shorter as it varies in the inner, I guess we'll call it the inner compression rod. I have to get the, I don't even think they tell you what it is in the manual. Point is, by adjusting this, it changes that. So leaving this in the position that you took it off, it should be the same, because there's no relevant indexing for the part that it applies pressure to. It's just a rod, so it should be the same. Some bikes, it's the rod is D-shaped, the letter D, so it has a flat on it, and then as you turn that, that adjusts your rebound or your compression. Forget how it is. Like my 82 Maxim XJ is that style, and you could get it misindexed, and then your settings would be wrong, so you could index them before you take it apart to make sure you go back to where you were. But on this bike, and most cartridge style bikes, irrelevant to that setup. This O-ring here we would want to inspect. Most of the time it's going to be good to reuse, and truthfully this one probably would be good to reuse too. But I bought new ones, so I'm going to put new ones on. Put an O-ring on, I'm going to take my pick, I'm going to flex it, and I'm going to pull the O-ring off, and then I'm going to lube up the new O-ring with some fork oil, and then I'm going to roll that onto here as well after I wipe this off, make this as clean as I can get it to be clean. We need to put our top washer on. It goes on top of the spring to compress it. There is a tapered edge to it again. I kept it in the same orientation and the taper was up. So I'm going to put it back. I'm going to have to feed it through my wire here first. And I'm going to pull up the damper rod. And we're going to go past it like so. And I'm going to use it to help hold that in place. So I'm going to keep that up there. Now again, the thread length here needs to be 12 millimeters, so I'm going to measure that. You can use caliper or pocket scale, either or. I'm going to rough it in here with the pocket scale, and then I'll confirm it with the caliper. Should be that. 12.15. So I think we're there. That would be the last part that we had to put on, was our washer here, spacer. Now I will screw on our cap. Hold everything together. If you were to manipulate this thread height, you would change the inner rod. If you recall, I'll show you here, this inner rod here, you would effectively change how close it is to that adjuster, being able to do this and that. So that's why you have a specification for where that needs to go. Again, it's important to keep them even between them. So I'm just going to snug this down. Finger tighted those together until they're just touching. Now I have the ability to undo my wire. A couple wraps here. And that the washer is in place and the cap is on, it can't fall apart on us. We do need to cinch this down with wrenches. So that was the 17 and a 14. There is a torque spec of this for 11 foot-pounds. However, that's going to be pretty tricky to accomplish without the appropriate crow's foot for your torque wrench. So we're just going to go with, we're going to cinch this down by hand and call it good like that. Now at this point I'll take the tape off here and we can bring these two parts together, push down and screw it together. Again, these threads are very fine, so we want to make sure we start it correctly and keep adequate pressure as we make our first couple revolutions, grabbing the threads, pulling them together. I'm going to bring these together. I'm going to try and push down on the cap, get it started. This is a little hard to do in the air, but I'm actually turning the inner tube to get it going. But that wasn't going to work. I'm going to have to push down on the cap some more. There we go. There, it's started. I think I'll add a little more lube to that O-ring. It feels a little drier than I would like it to be before it makes contact. Okay, we're going to have to get the socket on there. Actually torque this, you have to hold this as tight as you can. You might need a friend. You could put it in the jaws, the vise, with a lot of extra towels. You really don't want to squeeze too tight on this. But it's also key to note we don't want to clamp anything here, because that's going to pinch those threads again. Just like when we were in the triple clamp on the bike, we don't want to have pressure as we're torquing that down, so you want to grab a little bit lower. I'm going to look up torque specs and set that up to torque the cap. Had an obvious bonehead thing to do. Snug this down as far as you can by hand, but once we get it back into the triples, where the triples are holding it by the lower triple, we can torque it then, which it is 17 foot-pounds, 1-7. Torque that cap once it's back in the triples, holding it in place for us. Again, we'll just have the bottom one, the lower pinch bolt holding it, so these threads are not being compressed, and we'll torque it to 17 foot-pounds. At this point, we put this fork aside and we can do the other leg. Again, if you need to note your settings, it'd be a good time to check those out. You can write them down, how many lines you got exposed for your preload. Everything can certainly be readjusted at the end. Arguably, you could put this on the ground and pump it a few times. This isn't torqued, but the O-ring is still sealed, so it should still be a functioning fork. Check for leaks. But it's time to lather, rinse, and repeat and do the other leg. I don't think I'll record an entire other leg if anything comes up during that process. It's different or weird. I will record it, but it is just mirrored sides, so repeat the process. Well, there's the one done, leaning against the wall there. I just still have that piece of tape on there. It's not relevant. I'll peel that off before I slide it in there. I'll give video of the reinstallation, of course. I was just making notes of my settings on my other leg before I took leg number 2 out of there. And something came up in my mind, left and right of legs. Let's say you had both forks off and you mixed them up. Really, they can only go one way based on the bracketry for your brake calipers and the adjusters at the bottom as well. But certainly it's better to take one thing apart at a time so you're not intermixing your parts between your 2 legs. So try and keep everything compartmentalized per side. I would also like to say that yes, I only had one leg leaking, and technically I could have replaced just the one. I would have saved some part money there. Well, yes, technically it'd be half as much money, although I'd still be buying the fork oil of both containers because I want the 7.5. However, let's say you're doing the slides, so they're $16, and then seals and dust was another like 12, so 30, say $40 is probably what you're saving parts wise, realistically. It's worth doing both legs. Always do both legs together. If you do just one, you must be in an awful bind, and that's understandable, and you can certainly do it, but it just makes sense to do them in pairs. They work together. Now one's fresh and new. It's not gonna, the old one won't be working in the same methodology that the new one is. It's fresh, it's not contaminated, it's not sludged up. The weight, viscosity is different of the oil than the other one having contaminants in it. It's just going to work different, so it's best to keep them matching. So do both legs. always do both legs. Here's fork leg number 2. I admit I'm using impact tools to get the bottom bolt off. That was so much easier, of course. Less hassle. When you torque it, you still need to use the special tool to hold it in place while you're torquing it. If you didn't have a special tool, the 3/4 inch aluminum square tubing, or bikes that don't even use such a holding device, you put the cap back on and you can press the fork with all your might to put spring pressure down at the bottom while you torque that bolt. That's how it is on my XJ as well. But I wanted to point out this one is the non-leaking one, and you can see it is completely dry in there. So I'm really doing this just to match the other side. This one had no issues with it, but I'll breeze through it here. If I see anything else weird or worth noting, I will show it to you. If you were curious about the crush washers, this is the original, and here's a new one. And as far as dimensionally, I'm sure this is technically a metric of some kind, but this standard one fits within a couple hundredths of a millimeter. As far as the size goes, I'll measure it up real quick with some calipers here. The OD is 17.85 mils, or 0.7025 inches. You'd have to do your own conversion there for that. Let's do the ID. 0. ID is 4.79 inches, or 12.16. So I think technically this would be at, it's probably round up to a ½ inch, I suppose. Somewhere between probably ½ inch, 7/16, so I probably measured to be sure, but it is the correct fit for our bolt. So, it's worth grabbing these. These can be had at a hardware store or parts store. Technically they're not the metric ones, but it's going to be a-okay. I have now completed the other fork leg. We are ready to reinstall. I'll swing the camera around and do that. You might have some issues getting it up through the triples. You just might need to give it a little wiggle. You can lube the tubes with a little WD-40. Will help slide it in if need be. Things to note is your actual fork height within your triple clamps. Sometimes there is a machined stop in the triple for how high the fork can go in. Most of the time it's just alignment. Traditionally the factory spec would be to align the seam of the cap between the cap and the top of the tube, that seam with the top of the triple clamp. A lot of people manipulate their ride height that way by manipulating the forks, raising and lowering. For me, my forks were I think 6 millimeters taller. Was compensating for a tire change, and I'll probably put them back where they were. I made a note of that before I took it off. So we'll just wiggle them up into place and then gently cinch down a pinch bolt, and then we will adjust to the right height and then lock the lower pinch bolt and then torque that cap still. Remember, we have to do that. I'll point out that I did wire up my calipers, so I hope nobody will make too many hateful comments. I came back and I wired them as I figured I might as well. And then lastly, when sliding in the fork leg, be aware of your cable routing. If you had any zip ties you got to thread through, or just put cable on one side or the other. The fork would have been helpful to take a picture or something before you started. I guess I should have said at the beginning, but put it back where it was. Main thing is just don't want anything to bind or hit when you turn the bars lock to lock. I'll now feed in the clutch side fork first. Coming out from the bottom, you'll see it snaking its way through the triples. I figured that might be the most interesting angle to give you. There's not a lot to it other than you just gotta slide up your fork leg. A little twisting and pushing will get it where it needs to go. Just checking the cables, make sure they're on the correct side that they were before. And my triple clamp is just there. Excuse me. My clip-on is just out of the way, flopping right now while I turn this in. A little resistance there. I could have probably used a little lube there, but we're nearly there. You don't want to get too high, otherwise you won't have the flex, and your cable's needed to put this back on where it needs to go. And again, I'm just going to rough that in. I will have to set it correctly. Leave that bolt off for now. I'll have to get out my measuring device, and I wrote down my reference measurements from here to here. So I'll measure off the height of the clip-on, so I gotta make sure the clip-on is where it's going to be. And then make my reference points, measure my height, and then cinch down my pinch bolts. I'm just going to hand tighten them, and then I'll bring you in and we'll go through and torque them. I'm going to sneak up the other leg now, change the angles, probably not much you can see. This one I know I have a zip tie, and I'm going to thread through, so I'm going to use that. Boom, I already got that. Adjust the height here, and then I will cinch it. Currently only the lower triple clamp pinch bolt is cinched down just hand tight. I just snugged it up to hold it in place. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to torque our cap bolts here, which are 27 millimeters, and they go to 17 foot-pounds. If you didn't have these tools and you're using an adjustable wrench, I guess you just kind of cinch it down. It's got to make it seal, there's no O-ring in there, but we want to be careful not to strip things, so it is best to use a torque wrench. For all of these, even a $20 torque wrench would be better than no torque wrench. So I'm going to tighten that to 17. These are still loose, nothing's been tightened there, so we're not. Here we go. So, 17 there. Kind of turn my bars a bit. Here the other. Hitting something. Still no. Easier to go this way. I have a ratchet in here. That's what was hitting. Turn those up. And 17 on this one. And 17 on this one. You can see sometimes you got to get a little bit creative in how you're going to access that pinch bolt to get your wrench where you need it to be. I should note that I did loosen my front brake reservoir. I just loosened the bolt, and I'll have to tighten that back down again. But once you get your wrench in your position, you only get a couple clicks at a time. I might need to re-rig this with an extension. I don't know if I'm getting a good enough bite. There we go. Again, this is 27. Now I'm going to do both of the upper triple clamp pinch bolts. This is a 6mm and these are 22 foot-pounds. Guess I should have used a regular ratchet first. And repeat for the other side. Now for the rest of these handlebar bolts, both the pinch bolts and then the bolt holding the clip-on to top of the triple, all of these are 9.4 foot-pounds. Truthfully, you could easily just hand snug them up, but you want to do this bolt first here so it indexes your clip-on in the right place. And remember, you're using a steel bolt into aluminum, so be mindful of those threads. They'll be easy to strip out. So get yours started by hand, of course, and we'll just suck this in here. And I do have an inch-pound torque wrench, so I'm just going to torque these to 120 inch-pounds. Once I throw on an extension, and we'll put this to 120. Probably way more specific or accurate than it would need to be. At the end of the day, they just kind of hold the handlebar on. It's time to put the wheel back on. Here's a better shot of the Speedo drive gear, these little tabs. These are fixed, so it's not going to spin. So you have to spin the drive gear instead to match those tabs. So you'll index your drive gear, and it might take a little finagling to get everything to go together to match those tabs. And I'll just let the camera roll while I'm fighting all of this. Again, don't forget your spacer on the other side, and remember the orientation, the way it went. The Speedo drive is your spacer on the opposite side, and remember to be aware of your cable routing. You have to put your hanger back. It shares a bolt with brake caliper. We're going to have to spin this to match those. Right now I don't have the spacer on the other side. This gives me the clearance I need to get this on. Goes together, you'll feel it. It just kind of all pops into place. This is that little notch on the top. Little notch on the top of the Speedo drive here to this tab on the fork leg, so that'll come up together. So on the opposite side, I'm going to take my spacer and put that against the wheel, and then lift this together and then slide my axle through from the brake side to the clutch side. Sometimes it takes a few tries, a little bit of finagling and finesse. As far as your axle goes, a clean axle is a good axle. You could put a coat smearing of grease on here to help slide it in. That in no way affects your wheel spinning. Your bearings inside the wheel there, on the wheel hub, that would actually rotate your tire. So any grease coating on here would be for rust preventativeness, or so it doesn't seize in the future when you want to take it off again. Pinch bolts are obviously still very loose. We'll tighten those after we slide the axle through, but now I'm just going to muscle this up and get everything aligned together, and I might be blocking your view, but it's kind of necessary for what I have to do here. turn the fork leg on the side with the spacer out, allow that to up this way, and then you can slide your spacer and that'll turn your fork and then kind of all align everything together. And you can just sort of wiggle everything to get it together. And continue to wiggle your axle in place. Get the old dead blow hammer out. Tap. There she goes. Wheel spins lubberly. We'll put our washer on first. Our nut. And I'll have to look up the torque specs here for the front axle nut and the pinch bolts as well. Front axle nut is a 22 millimeter and it is torqued to 43 foot-pounds, 43 foot-pounds. The opposite side of the axle is a 17 millimeter hex, so you can hold that with your wrench there. To torque it, you could alternatively do your pinch bolts first, your pinch bolt on the brake side first to hold the axle in place. You don't want to do both pinch bolts because you need to be able to pull everything together. If that pinch bolt is there as you're tightening this nut, it's not going to jam everything together like it's supposed to. So we're going to do this to 43. Needed my 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter. And we will do these to 29. They are an 8 millimeter hex, and those will go to 29 foot-pounds. Now reinstall the brakes and the speedometer cable guide, shares a bolt, and then the fender. Or do the fender first and the brakes then. Your choice really isn't going to matter in this way. I'm going to unwire my brake calipers here and bring them down so they can be reinstalled. Hose guides that need to be bolted. Pads should just slide over. There is a gap here. That should just slide over your rotor in position. If you have to spread them, you could put pry bar in there. I'm going to unwire my brake calipers here and bring them down so they can be reinstalled. Hose guides that need to be bolted. Pads should just slide over. There is a gap here. That should just slide over your rotor in position. If you have to spread them, you could put pry bar in there. bushing's going to solve all my problems. This little guy is for the brake line. Here's a tab that lines up here with the other one. And this is a 10 mil. Now we can just cinch it down. Routed my caliper on the wrong side. I will be repeating the caliper installation on the other side and then install the fender. My fender's back on, and again it's just the Phillips head screw there and then this internal 10 millimeter that you come in from behind. Checking to make sure my lines aren't rubbing and they're directed and routed the way I want them to be in my brake lines. Wheel spins. I could pump up my brakes. Let's see. Brakes work. So that's good. And at this point here would probably just be to lower the bike. Pump it up. Cycle the forks a good couple times. Just bounce them up and down. And we'll check for any leaks around here. I already did that individually before I put them on, and didn't. And then ride it, of course. Be cautious at first, make sure everything is where it needs to be. If for some reason your bike is pulling one way or the other, you probably have a tweaked tube, and you would ideally you should have figured out which way it was tweaked before with some V-blocks if you had suspected it being off. But then you could possibly loosen up your pinch bolts and turn your inner tubes so that the curve, if you had it tweaked, instead of like being off to one side, like coming off cocked this way or cocked that way, that the bend would go front to rear. That way that your tire will still stay in line with the bike, so your tweak would just be slightly this way or slightly that way as opposed to one side or the other. Something to be aware of. You don't find out test drive. Check for leaks again, of course. Park probably in a clean spot of your garage floor if you can find one. If you can't, put on some cardboard after your ride and see if anything's trickling down the fork leg anymore like it was before. Otherwise, you are done with the fork seal replacement. Technically fork rebuild, because we did the bushings as well and all the other consumable parts. As you can see, it was easy enough to do. I did it all with just the basic hand tools. You could do it with less than what I even did if you needed to. So don't be intimidated to try this if you need. Scariest thing is probably lifting the bike, and if you have a friend, you can try any one of those creative methods and you should be fine without it tipping. If you're trying it by yourself, it can be a little more sketchy. The ratchet strap method worked fantastic for me for years until I got the proper stand. So that's what I would recommend if you were by yourself. One of those probably costs about 15 to 20 bucks these days. And then the Allen sockets, the hex sockets, 10 bucks for the metric set. Definitely worth it. It makes life so much easier than using just an Allen wrench, right angle wrench, or T-handles, and then you can put it on your torque wrench when you're ready for it. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Maybe we'll have some more bike videos in the future. Thanks. It's worth noting after you cycle the forks up and down a couple times, you will see some residual lines. from where the assembly lubes that were on the lips of the seals left, where they stopped. So you could bounce it a couple times and then you could wipe it, make it clean. Or after you ride it a bit, keep doing that for a couple of times, keep an eye on it, eventually it will stop and it'll stay clean. And then if you were having those lines in the future, then you would have a leak. But just be aware for the first while it's going to leave a ring as that assembly loop kind of wears its way away.